At 2:30 a.m., a whisper in a bedroom changes everything. A single message, not meant for me, becomes the crack that splits a life open. What follows is not just a story about betrayal or divorce. It's a story about how a woman loses an identity she's been handed her entire life, how she learns to trust her body and her own truth again, and how she builds a new life from the wreckage. This is Awake by Jen Hatmaker, a brutally honest, sometimes funny, often tender memoir about endings, middles, and beginnings. Stay with me, we'll go chapter by chapter. Jen Hatmaker is not a stranger. Pastor's wife turned best-selling author, podcaster, and public figure. 4 years she lived inside an ecosystem of church leadership, performance, and a devotion to clear rules, the kind of faith that prizes neat answers and rewarded right behavior. But Awake begins in the place every tidy script fears: collapse. The book is organized into 3 parts: the end, the middle, and the beginning, and Jen tells it as she lived it. Immediate, confessional, full of humor and humility. She walks us through the night she discovers her husband's betrayal, the months and years afterward, and the surprising ways she reclaims herself. The story is personal, yes, but it's also a mirror for anyone who's ever had a foundation shift under their feet. Let's begin. Part 1, the end. The end of a marriage rarely begins in one night, but for Jen Hatmaker, the collapse arrived suddenly at 2:30 a.m. in a quiet house with her phone lit in the dark. She describes that moment with clarity, her eyes scanning the screen, her body refusing to believe what her mind already knows. The air in the room feels different. A single message, 5 words not meant for her, shatters the life she's built over decades. She sits up in bed, adrenaline flooding her veins, pulse loud enough to hear. Her husband sleeps beside her, unaware that the truth is breathing down the hallway. Jen's narration is stripped of drama but filled with electricity, that eerie calm that comes right before the storm. She wakes him, confronts him, demands the truth. What she gets is fragments, evasions, and the devastating realization that the life she thought was secure is gone. By dawn, her decision is made. Pack your things. This is not a scene of rage, it's a scene of survival. Jen isn't performing strength. She's acting from instinct, clarity, and the kind of primal boundary that rises from deep inside when betrayal enters the house. She doesn't yet know what life after this will look like, but she knows one thing: it will not include pretending. From here, the narrative unfolds in waves, flashbacks, metaphors, memories that crash into the present. She remembers a moment from her youth, a church purity talk where a teacher passed around a rose. Every student touched it, tugged at the petals, bruised it just slightly until it was no longer fresh. When the teacher held up the wilted flower and asked, "Who would want this now?" something inside teenage Jen twisted. She didn't know it then, but that metaphor, meant to teach purity, became a seed of shame buried deep in her. The rose, she realizes decades later, was never the problem. The problem was the lesson, that a girl's worth could be damaged by contact, that love must be earned through restraint. Now, as an adult whose marriage has imploded, Jen returns to that dead rose. She sees how years of purity culture shaped her, how being a good woman meant being quiet, compliant, forgiving to the point of self-erasure. Betrayal hurts not only because of lost trust, but because it exposes the myth that being good could ever keep you safe. The dead rose becomes a symbol of reclamation. She's no longer trying to be untouchable. She's learning to be alive. After the emotional shock comes the logistical avalanche. There are bills to pay, lawyers to call, children to feed, and a mortgage to understand. The woman who once ran a household with a partner now faces spreadsheets, phone calls, and panic. Jen confesses her ignorance about money, not out of self-deprecation, but honesty. Like so many women in long marriages, she delegated financial details. Now she's forced to confront them alone. The irony is painful. While her emotional world collapses, her practical one demands precision. She learns to read contracts, to refinance, to check account balances. She spends hours on hold with banks, voice trembling but resolute. These scenes, mundane on the surface, are deeply symbolic. Each form signed, each account opened is a declaration of independence. Grief, she discovers, can coexist with competence. Taking control of her finances becomes an act of quiet rebellion, the first bricks in rebuilding her sense of agency. When you're in crisis, memory behaves strangely. It drags you backward to moments that explain who you became. Jen remembers Mrs. Anderson, a strict grade school teacher who dismissed her sensitivity as weakness. She remembers the sting of being misunderstood, the moment she decided that perfection was safer than honesty. Then she remembers her father, protective, present, the man who showed up when she was humiliated in front of the class. These fragments become emotional touchstones. The point isn't nostalgia, it's pattern recognition. The same instinct that led her to hide her hurt as a child is the one that made her overfunction in her marriage, managing, smoothing, rescuing. Her father's defense reminds her that strength doesn't always mean silence. So, when she now calls her family to tell them what's happened, she leans into that inherited resilience. Her people show up, her siblings, her dad, her friends, surrounding her with the kind of love that has no performance clause. One day after discovering the messages, Jen finds herself in a law office, fluorescent lights, manila folders, and the faint hum of a printer. She can barely process the surreal contrast. Just a week ago, she was speaking at a church event, smiling for photos. Now, she's dividing assets. Her lawyer explains paperwork while she nods numbly, mind skipping between grief and logistics. The legal process feels cold, procedural, but necessary. It transforms chaos into a list of actions, and actions are something she can handle. Sitting in that office, she realizes something profound. Her entire adult life was built around spiritual systems that promised to protect her from worldly pain. Yet here she is at a lawyer's desk, using earthly means to defend herself. For the first time, she sees the sacredness in practicality. Faith, she muses, might be less about miracles and more about showing up to sign your own papers. Divorce never affects only two people. Jen has 5 children, each reacting in their own way: confusion, anger, sadness, silence. She refuses to exploit their pain, writing only what is hers to tell. But through her narration, we glimpse the heart-wrenching work of keeping a home intact when the foundation is cracked. There are family meetings, long hugs in doorways, unspoken questions about loyalty and safety. She describes the small mercies, shared laughter over dinner, inside jokes that survive the storm. There's tenderness in her restraint, the way she shields her kids from the public spectacle, how she honors their privacy, even while living her life online. This balance between truth-telling and protection becomes one of her hardest lessons. Her motherhood, once defined by partnership, now becomes an anchor. The kids become her why, even when the how feels impossible. The title of this chapter references the prophet Jeremiah, the verse that claims, "The heart is deceitful above all things." It's a verse Jen has heard her whole life, used as a warning against trusting your own desires. But now she interrogates it. Maybe, she wonders, her heart wasn't deceitful. Maybe it was silenced. Maybe all those years she ignored her intuition were the real betrayal. This internal reckoning becomes one of the book's quiet revolutions, learning to believe her body, to trust her inner knowing. In therapy, she begins to see how religious conditioning taught her to override instinct, to spiritualize discomfort instead of addressing it. Healing, then, becomes a spiritual act of its own, unlearning the fear of herself. Jeremiah's warning becomes her reawakening. No one survives devastation alone. Jen's friends assemble like first responders, some staying overnight, others delivering meals or sitting in silence beside her. One friend parks outside her house while she confronts her husband, a silent guardian, just in case things go wrong. These moments capture the sacredness of friendship without sentimentality. There's humor amid the pain, texts full of dark jokes, casseroles laced with love and profanity. In these chapters, Jen also reflects on the concept of hidden corners, the secret rooms in every relationship where truth hides. Sometimes we build them to protect others. Sometimes we build them to protect ourselves. She's determined now to live without them, to flood her life with light. Healing, she says, is not just confession, it's refusing to go back to the shadows. Jen's narrative dives into memory again, examining the formative years of purity culture that shaped her understanding of sex and shame. There's the teacher, Mr. Berman, whose attention felt uncomfortable but confusing, an early lesson in blurred boundaries and silence. There's Falls Creek, a youth camp where boys were warned against lust and girls were warned against being temptations. There's the secret journal she kept, her first act of honest expression, a way to speak when she couldn't speak aloud. She revisits the topic of pornography with compassion, not condemnation. Instead of moralizing, she sees it as part of a culture that failed both men and women by teaching shame instead of integrity. These reflections are courageous because they dismantle systems she once helped uphold. She's rewriting the theology of her youth, not to destroy it, but to tell the truth it couldn't hold. As part 1 draws to a close, Jen introduces Judy, a body worker and healer who helps her reconnect to physical sensation after months of numbness. Through breathing exercises, touch therapy, and energy work, Jen begins to feel her grief literally move through her body. She learns that healing is not a single moment, but a slow unwinding of pain stored in muscles and bones. Judy teaches her that the body keeps the score, and the body can also keep the healing. Interwoven is a lighter story about a teenage Jeep misadventure, a reminder that humor and nostalgia can coexist with heartbreak. Her mother appears, too, steady and loving, holding space for her daughter's grief without trying to fix it. These stories act as emotional oxygen between the heavy chapters. By the end of part 1, Jen stands at the edge of the wreckage, exhausted but alive. The shock has subsided into clarity. The world she built is gone, but the woman who remains is still standing, blinking into a new unwritten dawn. Part 2, the middle. After the immediate chaos settles, silence sets in. The phone calls slow down. The lawyers stop emailing. The adrenaline that carried Jen through the first weeks fades, and what's left is a strange, hollow quiet. This is the middle, the part of healing that nobody glamorizes, the stretch where grief becomes both routine and unpredictable. Jen begins this season like many people do after loss, by trying to survive one day at a time. She wakes up in a house that feels too big, every corner echoing with absence. Mornings become her reckoning hour, coffee in hand, staring at the table where a family once gathered whole. The air feels heavier, but also oddly clean. She's learning to breathe again, even if the breath is shallow. The middle is where she begins to meet grief as a companion, not just an intruder. It's a slow, brutal apprenticeship in feeling. One afternoon, Jen drives aimlessly through her neighborhood until she parks under a pecan tree. The grief hits her mid-sentence, mid-breath. She can't contain it anymore. The screaming, the shaking, the sobs that feel like earthquakes. She describes it as her body doing what her brain couldn't, releasing. In those moments, she realizes how long she's carried the weight of composure. Her body, she writes, was always telling the truth before my mouth could. Therapy begins to reshape how she relates to herself. She's taught to stop analyzing the pain and instead locate it in her throat, her chest, her stomach. This is new territory for someone who's spent decades spiritualizing emotion. Crying becomes prayer. Breathing becomes surrender. There's holiness, she realizes, in letting yourself fall apart. In the midst of this emotional unraveling, Jen's circle of women keeps her tethered to life. Her friend Amy appears like a gentle hurricane, smudging sage in the house, burning incense, clearing air that has held too many secrets. Once, Jen might have rolled her eyes at such rituals, but now she understands. These are ceremonies for the body, ways to mark transition when no church service exists for what she's living through. Another friend, Judy, the healer introduced earlier, continues to guide her through somatic work, body-based therapy that helps release trauma. Through massage, energy alignment, and deep breathing, Jen experiences moments of relief so profound she weeps mid-session. These are not miracles, but micro-healings, tiny recoveries that remind her she is still inside her own skin. The women around her create what she calls her sacred circle. They don't demand optimism or tidy faith. They just show up, bearing food, laughter, and presence. For a woman whose life revolved around structured religion, this new spirituality, grounded in touch, food, and friendship, feels radical. Here, she learns that salvation can look like soup on the stove and a friend on the porch. Loneliness creeps in slowly like a fog. The nights are the hardest, quiet stretches of time that used to be filled with conversation, now haunted by absence. Jen writes about standing in the kitchen, cooking dinner for her kids, and realizing she's humming again. Music, food, and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables become her first signs of healing. The act of feeding people reawakens her sense of purpose. This is where her cookbook project is born. What started as a creative distraction becomes therapy through taste and texture. Each recipe is an anchor, something she can control in a world that feels uncontrollable. She experiments, she laughs, she feeds her friends and family, and in doing so, she begins to re-inhabit her joy. Still, the loneliness remains. Some nights, she sits with it. Other nights, she writes through it. There's no skipping this part, she tells herself. The middle demands patience, the willingness to live inside the ache until it softens. As weeks turn to months, Jen faces the slow bureaucracy of healing. Forms to sign, taxes to file, new insurance to set up. These tasks don't make good memoir material, but she insists they matter. Paying the bills, calling the bank, closing accounts. These are the unglamorous acts of self-rescue. Every form is a statement. I'm still here. I can do this. There's also therapy, long walks, and learning to say no. She relearns solitude not as punishment but as peace. The old version of herself, the people-pleaser, the fixer, the optimist who never stops spinning plates, begins to fade. In her place stands a quieter, more grounded woman who has learned to rest. Parenting after divorce becomes a daily test of grace. Jen describes the emotional labor of being both parent and comforter, disciplinarian and safe place. There are soccer games, parent-teacher meetings, and nights when everyone just eats cereal for dinner because no one has the energy for more. Her kids, each carrying their own version of grief, teach her what resilience looks like. They start to joke again, to tease her, to make fun of her playlists. She notices laughter returning to the house, tentative but real. One of her sons cracks a joke so unexpected that she doubles over laughing, and then bursts into tears. Healing, she realizes, often looks like that. Laughter tangled with crying, joy braided with sorrow. Public life complicates everything. As a well-known Christian figure, Jen's divorce becomes fodder for gossip and debate. She receives both compassion and cruelty from the faith community she once called home. Some churches distance themselves. Old allies fall silent. It's an excruciating public unmasking, not just of her marriage, but of the institution she once trusted. And yet, amidst the loss, she discovers a new kind of church, one made up of friends who meet in kitchens instead of sanctuaries. They cook, they cry, they laugh, they pray with language that's half irreverent, half holy. In these circles, faith is no longer about answers, it's about presence. She writes, "If God is love, then my people are proof that he still lives somewhere near my table." The backlash hurts, but it also liberates. For the first time, she isn't performing faith to keep a seat at the table. She's building her own table, inviting whoever wants to come. As stability slowly returns, Jen begins to consider the unthinkable, dating. The idea feels absurd at first. She jokes about not knowing how apps work, about her friends insisting she deserves joy again. There's fear, excitement, awkwardness. The first coffee date feels like skydiving. She laughs about overthinking every text, about Googling dating etiquette at 40-something. But beneath the humor is a powerful theme, reclamation. Desire, once suppressed or shamed, now becomes sacred curiosity. She's learning what it means to want laughter, companionship, touch, and connection without guilt. These moments, she writes, are less about romance and more about returning to her own body, her own worth. Toward the end of this middle stretch, Jen introduces a metaphor, the lighthouse. She pictures herself standing inside it, surrounded by dark seas. The waves still crash, but she no longer fears them. The light she keeps shining isn't for someone else to find her, it's for her to remember where she is. The lighthouse becomes her symbol for self-trust, staying rooted in her truth even when storms rage. She has learned that survival isn't about erasing pain, it's about lighting your own way through it. Every therapy session, every meal cooked, every laugh shared with her kids, all of it becomes a beam of light cutting through the fog. By the end of part 2, the panic has eased. The grief hasn't vanished, but it no longer owns her. She's found rhythm again, work, rest, laughter, even hope. The woman who once lived by certainty now walks by awareness. She no longer needs to be rescued or defined. She's doing the sacred, steady work of rebuilding herself, one quiet, ordinary day at a time. Part 3, the beginning. If part 1 was the storm and part 2 the long, gray recovery, part 3 is sunrise, soft at first, almost uncertain, but growing warmer by the day. It doesn't announce itself with triumph. It drifts in quietly, through laughter, food, and long summer evenings that don't ache quite as much anymore. This is where Jen begins to live, not just survive. She starts by noticing the small resurrections. The way sunlight hits her kitchen counter, how coffee tastes when it's not gulped in exhaustion, how music fills the house without stirring old memories. The silence that once screamed is now peace. The house hasn't changed, but she has. Her body is lighter, her laughter freer, her faith reshaped by honesty. This is the beginning, not of perfection, but of presence. Summer arrives as a balm. Jen finds herself surrounded by her children, her friends, and the hum of everyday life. There's a rhythm now. Dinners on the porch, gardening, hosting neighbors, and the constant sound of kids moving in and out of the house. After years of emotional storms, these days feel like exhaling. She's still healing, but healing has become ordinary, woven into daily life instead of set apart from it. She builds a large wooden table for her backyard, wide, imperfect, and strong. Around it, she gathers everyone she loves. She cooks, she laughs, she watches people eat until they're full and loud and happy. For years, the table symbolized what she'd lost: family dinners, shared prayers, the illusion of wholeness. Now it becomes something else entirely, a declaration that she can create belonging from scratch. Love, she realizes, doesn't have to be preserved, it can be built anew. The table becomes the axis of her new faith, one that measures holiness by generosity, not dogma. She says, if you're hungry, you're welcome. No theological test, no entry requirement, just presence. This radical hospitality is the fruit of all her loss. When everything is stripped away, what remains is love. As she settles into this new rhythm, Jen revisits the physical healing work she began earlier. The ritual of closing the bones, once a novelty, now holds deep meaning. It's a practice borrowed from postpartum care, a ceremony for women whose bodies have stretched and broken open. For Jen, it's about closure and renewal, an embodied way to honor all that she has endured. She describes lying on the mat as her healer wraps her in cloth and rocks her gently, as if tucking her back into herself. In that moment, she realizes that she has been living outside her body for years, detached, performing, surviving. Now she's returning home. It's not mystical, just deeply human. Healing, she discovers, is not an exorcism of pain, but an integration of it. Her body holds memory, but it also holds possibility. It begins almost accidentally, a friendly message, a casual invitation, and a heartbeat she hasn't felt in years. Dating after decades of marriage feels like learning a new language. She's awkward, self-conscious, and hilariously out of practice. She worries about what to wear, what to say, and whether she's ready at all. But curiosity wins. The date itself is simple: dinner, laughter, nervous energy. The conversation flows easily, and for the first time, she notices her reflection in someone's eyes and doesn't feel broken. There's no fairy tale ending here, no cinematic romance, just the quiet joy of realizing she can feel again. She writes about walking to her car afterward, smiling to herself, whispering, "I'm still alive." That's the power of this new beginning, not the search for replacement love, but the rediscovery of worth, of wanting, of possibility. The metaphor of the table returns again and again, not just as furniture, but as theology. It becomes the heart of her new community. Friends, family, exiles, doubters, everyone belongs here. They talk about faith and doubt, parenting, love, failure and joy. The table holds all of it. Through this shared space, Jen's understanding of God changes. Divinity no longer lives in pulpits or certainty. It lives in laughter, bread, forgiveness, and real connection. She's learned that the sacred isn't what happens in church. It's what happens when people show up for one another without condition. The table, imperfect and weathered, becomes her altar. The beginning doesn't mean everything is easy. There are days when old grief reappears like an echo, an anniversary, a scent, a song that pulls her backward. But these moments no longer swallow her. She's learned to let grief visit without unpacking its bags. She's writing again, cooking again, loving again. Work resumes not as escape but as expression. Her podcast flourishes, her community grows, and she's transparent about the messiness behind the scenes. The woman who once thought her public identity depended on perfection now lives in authenticity. She's honest about struggle and joy in equal measure. The difference is internal. She no longer performs wholeness, she practices it. The final movement of Jen's story is quiet but radiant. She writes about standing barefoot in her yard one morning, dew on the grass, sun rising, birds singing. It's an ordinary moment, but it feels monumental. For the first time in years, she doesn't feel like a survivor, she feels awake. Awake to her senses, her surroundings, her own worth. Awake to laughter, to friendship, to the idea that endings can be beginnings in disguise. Awake to the truth that peace doesn't arrive when pain disappears. It arrives when you stop resisting what is. She looks back on her old life with compassion, not bitterness. The version of herself who believed in tidy marriages, neat faith, and absolute certainty did her best with what she knew. But now she knows better. She knows that living truthfully is holier than living perfectly. Awake ends not with resolution, but with reclamation. Jen Hatmaker doesn't hand us a guide to happy endings. She offers something more honest, a guide to staying present in the unfinished parts of life. Her story reminds us that transformation isn't one grand leap. It's 1,000 small steps, a signature on a form, a dinner with friends, a laugh that breaks through grief. She emerges not as a woman restored to what she was, but as someone entirely new, grounded, aware, unafraid. She's learned that healing isn't about going back. It's about going deeper into truth, into body, into love that doesn't need approval to exist. And that's the essence of being awake, to live eyes open, heart open, utterly human, ready for whatever comes next.